Good morning, church. Oh. So when I was growing up, we had sort of a family ritual or tradition that after we finished up farm chores, we came in and we would often listen to WDAC. I think some of you are probably familiar with it. And at 6:30, Adventures in Odyssey came on. Some of you might remember this and have done the same thing. And then after that, there was this kids' request time or song hour or something like that. I don't remember the name exactly. But they would have songs, and I think they had stories. And one of the stories I remember from the kids' request hour, and I'm curious if anyone else knows this story, but it's a story of a monkey at a zoo. Seeing if anyone else is nodding their heads. Oh, good. Diane, maybe you can help me if I get stuck on the story. No, I remember the basics, but I do have some parts that I'm filling in a little bit. I honestly went to try and Google and find the story, and Google failed me. But I learned some other things. But the story of this monkey is at a zoo, and he gets freed somehow. So he can get to his freedom. But as he is trying to get away to his freedom, he sees an apple between two bars. And he reaches through the bars, grabs this apple, but he can't get his hand out. And so he's holding onto this apple and he can't get out his hand. And all of a sudden the other animals see the zookeeper coming and they all are telling him to let go of the apple and to hurry, hurry, they all say. But he won't. And in the end, he gets stuck. He won't let go of the apple. And so the zookeeper comes and he never gets free. At least that's how I remember the story. I don't know if that's okay, good. So in case you needed a visual illustration of what this might look like, I have my own version. You have to pretend this is two bars. And if you reach your hand in and hold on to the apple, I can't really get my hand back out. So you can't hold the apple and get your hand back out at the same time. If you have a smaller hand, you probably can. But hopefully I can get my hand back out. Yeah. Otherwise, this would be an exciting sermon. Yeah. But so picture the monkey holding on to his apple. You may have heard this called, it's also, what I learned from Google was that this is also referred to as the monkey trap, where a monkey can put his hand into a coconut and there's rice in there, but he can't get his hand back out of the coconut without letting go of the rice. So you can picture me holding that apple, trying to get it back out, but I can't unless I let go of the apple. The monkey couldn't get to freedom without letting go of the apple and taking his hand out from the bars. And so, right, instead of letting go and finding real freedom, that monkey hangs on to this apple or the rice and the coconut. He's being held on the spot, right, by what he's holding on to. The monkey is, in a sense, possessed by his possession, right? And our text this morning in Luke opens with this example of a wealthy man acting, I think, in some ways like this monkey. He's clinging on to what he has, right? And he's finding his security in what he holds. However, it's going to close us with a different image and a different animal. The closing image or animal that gets referenced in this passage is that of sheep, or a flock of sheep, God's flock. These sheep, which are a part of the flock of God, are called to know and to trust in God's daily provision and care, right? To not be afraid or worry, and thus to give generously, to be open-handed. So Jesus, I think in this passage, presents us with two options, two ways of living or engaging in the world, ways of thinking about our possessions, which I'm kind of characterizing as the monkey, the clinging on to, or the sheep, which are trusting in their shepherd to guide them, to feed them, to provide for them. And so the text is going to invite us to consider these questions, right? What are we holding on to? What are you and what am I holding on to that in reality might actually be possessing us, holding us, keeping us trapped there with our hand in that jar? It also invites us to entrust ourselves to the goodness of God, to really see who Jesus is, know his goodness, know that he is trustworthy, and then to open our hands, right? To open our hands so that we can invest in his kingdom and in the treasure, as Tom mentioned, that we are storing up our treasures in heaven. And so we have this image, right, of not clinging, but opening up our hands and investing and giving towards God and the things that he is calling us to. So would you turn with me to Luke chapter 12, or you can follow on the screens. It'll be in English and in Spanish. It's a longer passage. I'm going to read from Luke 12, 13 to 34, but I think it's worth reading it in its entirety because of just the power of the passage itself. So it begins in Luke 12, verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and then I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all of his splendor was dressed like one of these. If this is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. As we listen to Jesus' words, we can see in this passage sort of three main parts. It begins with this request from a man in the crowd, which Jesus then uses to teach them. He gives this parable around greed and possessions. Then Jesus will turn to his disciples and invites them to not worry, right? He invites them to see God's goodness, to recognize the goodness of God. And lastly, he will then encourage them to use all they have to give to those in need, right? to use their resources towards the goodness of God's kingdom, to invest in that kingdom. And I think central throughout this teaching is that God's goodness invites us away from a life of clinging to what we have, right? Clinging to those possessions for security, and invites us to a life of generosity, right? Trusting in God's provision and knowing the true treasures found in God's kingdom. We have that picture of God's goodness inviting us away from holding tightly in towards opening our hands and giving and investing in his kingdom. So I'm just going to walk us through the passage a little this morning, just making some points and talking a little bit about what is significant, how this might impact our own lives. The whole teaching gets launched, right, by a man wanting Jesus to step into his inheritance dispute that he has with his brother. There's very little told about it. Jesus does not elaborate. The gospel writers don't elaborate on the dispute. Some thought that they inherited a property together, and the younger brother likely now wants to divide that property so that he can have his own portion of it instead of living together with his brother. But however, instead of making some ruling and giving his opinion, Jesus rejects this role of being an arbiter between them and gets to the heart of the matter in this case with a warning and then a parable. The warning is watch out, right? Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, because life does not consist in an abundance of possessions, right? Life does not equal what we have accumulated. To illustrate then, Jesus gives this fairly well-known parable, right? Notice that in it, he identifies this as a wealthy landowner. The man who receives this abundant harvest is already a wealthy landowner in a subsistence agricultural society. And he, the landowner, deliberates what to do, what he should do, and he decides to tear down his barns and build bigger ones so that he can store all of his grain and all of his goods, so that he can then take life easy and no longer worry. But then that very night, he dies. And God denounces him as a fool. Why? Because his life was completely disoriented, right? It focused only on the temporal instead of on the eternal and what really mattered. He focused on securing his own comforts and ease without regard for God or for others. And so Jesus' warning, I think, just in this parable, gives us that picture again of that monkey hanging on to that apple, unwilling to let go when freedom was really available to him. To make the illustration more accurate, you can imagine that that monkey already has a huge pile of apples sitting there. And yet he still won't let go of this one. This rich man could only see himself and how he could have benefited from this abundant harvest by holding on to all of it, right? To create that life of ease for himself. And now, Scripture in many places, right, has a lot of teachings on money, right? It's going to teach us to be good stewards of what we have. It's going to teach us the value of enjoying the goodness of what God has given us. But here in this passage, we are particularly warned about our desires and against placing our trust and our security in our possessions. And as much as I might want a really great sports car, right, I think the question is, right, what might it be holding on to too tightly? David, do you know what sports car that is? No, it's a Bugatti. I only know this because of David. So, but it asks us, right, what might we be holding on to too tightly? What am I striving for? What am I trusting in? So I just take a moment, right? The car is a little bit of a joke, right? But what are the things that we might honestly be holding on to too tightly? What are the things that we might be striving for, trusting in? I'll just give us a moment to pause, and then we'll look at what Jesus speaks into our own strivings. after Jesus gives this parable, right, he's going to turn to his disciples. He's speaking kind of to the crowd, and then in the text, we have this invitation that he turns towards his disciples. And he's going to focus on the anxiety and the worry that drove this man in the parable to secure a life of ease for himself. So he turns us from possessions towards what often drives our desire to hold on to those things, that worry and that anxiety. And he's going to remind the disciples and to encourage them to look at the nature of God and what it means for their lives and ours too. In short, right, he's going to say, do not worry, right? See the goodness of God all around you and that he will care for you. Let's look at what Jesus says not to worry about. He says, don't worry about your life, what one will eat, and what one will wear. Very basic aspects to our lives. Now remember, again, who Jesus is talking to. He's talking into a culture that was basically subsistence agriculturalists, right? Many of you know that Sarah and I oversee a museum at the seminary, and when I'm taking people through the museum, we have just tons of household, everyday life items. And what always strikes me as I walk through and look at these things from the time of Jesus, from the time of David, and other periods of biblical history, is just how much of life was invested in growing your crops, right? How much of life was invested in putting food on the table, that whole process from planting to harvesting to then grinding the grain and making the bread, and every day that daily work of feeding the family, and how much was invested in the clothes that they wear, from the like getting the wool and shearing it and spinning it. Most homes probably had a loom in it where they would make their clothes and their blankets and things like that. So this was everyday life that he says. When he says, don't worry about your food and what you will wear, he's talking about just what made up every day of their lives, right? And I think if I were to just maybe add to it, of course, we worry about food and clothes and things like that at times as well. But I might add into a modern context, right? Do not worry so much about your career and your social status, right? Life is more than what you do and how much you earn, what you own, or the number of friends or likes you have, right? Life is more than what marketing advertisers seek to convince us that we need, right? And how does Jesus address this particular worry? He tells them to look at the world around them. He's going to invite them to see how God cares for it, right? He says, look at the ravens. They do not plant or harvest. They don't even have investment strategies. And yet God feeds them, right? Or consider the grass of the fields and how God takes time to make it beautiful with wildflowers. God didn't have to make the grass beautiful with its flowers, but he does, right? The grass, right, that's transitory and in Israel would be gathered up eventually and used to fuel their fires. God takes the time, even for a month or so, to sprinkle wildflowers across it. God cares to clothe our fields in beauty. And so Jesus will ask them, do you see the gracious hand of God in these easily overlooked areas of creation, right? Random birds and fields. And then he reasons from that we can rest assured that God knows our needs for food and clothes, because he knows the needs of each part of his creation. And he will reason too that for how many of us has worry ever prolonged our lives? Jesus invites us to look at who God is, right? To simply consider the goodness of God and to trust and to let go of that daily worry. You know, as we think about Lent, it's often a season in which we give up something. We might give up certain foods or habits or something else that you might just take out of your daily life. But I think our text today invites us to consider giving up the worry, right, that drives our desire to cling to what we have. And if you're like me, that's going to be a slow and long process, right? You don't just give up our worry one day. At least I don't. But maybe it's when a worry comes to mind, handing that back over to God, saying a prayer, giving it back to him. Because we are invited to see how good and truly how loving God is. And to turn, right, our longings to him, our worries to him, to simply entrust ourselves to him. So this week, just something you could do, at least something I thought about you could do, is you could look around, just like in this teaching where Jesus looks around and says, don't you see God's goodness here and don't you see God's goodness there? Maybe you can make a list or just jot down, or maybe when you're driving or going to work, think of the ways where you see God's goodness at work. And make a real list, make a mental list. Maybe it's the spring flowers that are coming up. Maybe it's the kindness of a friend. And then take that list out. Read over it, right? And think about the fact that, I see your goodness here and here and here. Help me to trust you more over here. Help me to trust you with this. And this area, maybe you're praying to see God's goodness in a particular area. But just take those little steps. I think it's the daily reminders. Often it's the daily reminders for me that are impactful. As Jesus closes out this teaching, he's going to tell his disciples to seek God's kingdom, right? To not be afraid. He'll say pretty bold things, right? Sell your possessions, give to the poor, store up the treasure in heaven where it will not be destroyed or stolen. Jesus points them to what has ultimate significance and worth in this life, right? He reminds them that they are God's little flock. He calls them little flock, and that they are a part of God's big kingdom. In essence, they are already cared for and provided for like the sheep with the very best shepherd, just as we read the 23rd Psalm, right? I hear that in the background to this teaching. They have all the riches of the Father. And the invitation is now to live in light of these truths, right? Unlike the wealthy landowner who just felt like he needed to hold on to everything, they're called to sell and to give to those in need. So what does it mean to truly live into this teaching of Jesus? Do we sell all we have? We know that in the early church, many lived in this communal way. We see them doing that at the start, selling their possessions, holding things in common together. And we know through church history, some have chosen this route. Of selling what they have. But we also see, even in the book of Acts and through church history, many keep their homes, and they maintain their lives and their livelihoods, but live life giving, right? And in service to God and to God's work in the world. Last week, Sarah talked to us about radical, ordinary hospitality. And what I see in today's text is sort of an invitation to that radical and kind of ordinary generosity. And so if you can allow me to switch, we've been talking about how we are the sheep, the flock of God, and that we're cared for, and we can trust. We are also, I think, invited by God to recognize that we are also shepherds, under shepherds, those who he commissions to care for others, and who model, right, his own generosity and his own goodness. So good shepherds, right, care for their sheep. Each of us has resources at our disposal. They might be financial, but they might be time, and they might be other things that we have. And we can use those for connecting others to Jesus or showing others Jesus' love, right? This, on the practical level, this can include a lot of things, right? Giving to organizations, right, that are invested in gospel and kingdom-oriented work. This can include giving our time, our personal resources. Maybe it's simply being with people to help support them. And I know this group here practices this in a day in and day out kind of way. But I think there's always just that invitation to look at where is God calling us? Where is he leading us? How can we just continue to walk in this way? These are just pictures of shepherds and sheep in Israel, just to again remind you that we are both sheep, but we're also called to be those who are caring, like shepherds, caring for others. And I think Jesus' words, right, they continue to remind us of the value of living with those open hands and open hearts. To remember that what matters is not how much we have, right, but the work of his kingdom. That as we invest in that, we are truly storing up beautiful treasure that will not be destroyed. Moth will not eat it, rust will not take it away. Uh, it is everlasting treasure as we invest in the work of God's kingdom. I'd like to close this morning as I thought about this passage, and I thought both about Psalm 23, Jesus' words to us. It reminds me so much, too, of the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples to pray. And so would you close by praying with me the Lord's Prayer? You can pray in English or in Spanish. All right. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.